February 1943, Sid Bou Zid, Tunisia. The desert had fallen silent. The wind dragged thin veils of dust across a battlefield still littered with the twisted remains of war. And there, standing where dozens of machines had died, one tank remained alive. An American M4A1 Sherman, scarred, sand-stained, but unbroken. Its olive paint still bore the white star of the United States, now hastily covered by a black cross of the Wehrmacht. The name painted on the hull read, War Daddy 2. Officers of Heavy Panzer Battalion 501 circled the machine in disbelief. A fully operational American tank, captured intact. Something that shouldn't have been possible. But the real shock came when they started it. While their own vehicles often coughed and stalled after a few kilometers, this foreign machine simply worked. No overheating, no oil leaks, no mechanical complaints. It rolled across sand and stone as if the desert itself obeyed it. One officer touched the engine block with the back of his hand. Warm, but steady. The Continental R975 radial engine, borrowed from American aircraft production, idled with a confidence that felt alien. Every sound it made contradicted everything the Germans believed about American engineering. Within days, a reconnaissance team would drive this captured Sherman 350 kilometers across the harsh terrain to the port of Sfax without a single breakdown. A small triumph, perhaps, but one that would soon shake the foundations of German technical pride. Because when this tank reached Germany, and the engineers at Kummersdorf began to study it, they would uncover a truth far more devastating than any defeat on the battlefield. They would realize that this machine was not built to impress. It was built to endure. It was not the work of genius. It was the result of industrial maturity. And that made it unstoppable. That February in the Tunisian desert marked the beginning of a revelation. The myth of German mechanical supremacy was about to break. Because the Sherman was not just a tank. It was a miracle of steel. The first report reached Berlin wrapped in dust and disbelief. It came from Tunisia, typed on a field telegraph sheet stained with oil and sand. One line stood out to the Army Weapons Office. Captured American tank completed approximately 350 kilometers under desert conditions without mechanical failure. Most officers scoffed. 350 kilometers, without a breakdown. A Panzer IV couldn't travel half that distance before needing repairs. Someone scribbled in the margin. Impossible. Likely exaggeration. Yet the report kept moving upward. At the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Ordnance Office, engineers argued whether to ignore or investigate. One colonel waved it off. The Americans build cars, not tanks. Another replied quietly, if this is true, we must learn how. That single doubt sealed the tank's fate. By early March 1943, a telegram reached Tunisia ordering the captured M4A1 Sherman, now nicknamed War Daddy II, to be shipped intact to Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, south of Berlin. Priority. Preserve all systems exactly as found. The officers overseeing the loading at Sfax treated it as a curiosity. It was tagged Technical Examination number 259, its hatches sealed, its new black cross painted over the fading white star. To most, it was nothing more than a foreign oddity, a propaganda photo opportunity at best. But a few sensed something different. A mechanic from Maybach wrote privately, "Perhaps their simplicity hides something we have forgotten." As the cargo ship left the Tunisian coast, the tank sat silent under its tarp, still smelling of gasoline and desert dust. In Berlin, engineers debated perfection on paper. In the hold below, a machine built for imperfection waited to rewrite the rules. Because what the Germans were about to study wasn't just a tank, it was a mirror, and the reflection would hurt. Spring 1943, Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, Brandenburg. 25 kilometers south of Berlin, beyond pine forests and security checkpoints, lay the beating heart of German military engineering, Versuchsanstalt, Kummersdorf. Here, the Reich tested everything, from artillery and tanks to rockets and experimental fuels. Now, a new arrival stood on the rail siding, dust-caked, olive green, and utterly foreign. The tarp was pulled away. An American Sherman, its white star faint beneath a fresh black cross. A new identification code had already been stenciled across the hull, Zugkraft 259. Officers and engineers crowded around the flat car. They had read the desert report. Few believed it. Now, seeing the tank up close, skepticism turned to confusion. It looked plain, almost crude. No complex curves, no intricate fittings, no proud craftsmanship. Just thick armor, solid welds, and straightforward design. Cameras clicked. Chalk lines appeared across the armor. They measured thickness, slope, and weld angles with their usual precision. Every note in their ledgers carried the same undertone. Simplistic. But when they began disassembly, the tone changed. Inside the transmission housing, they found herringbone gears, double helical teeth that ran smooth and self-centering. A design Germany admired but rarely used, claiming it was too laborious for large-scale production. Yet the Americans had built thousands, and these were not machined to perfection. They were forgiving, cut with tolerances that allowed for mass production without losing strength. The chief examiner frowned, turning the part over in his hands. "Rough," he said, "but brilliant." Then came the 5-speed synchronized gearbox. From second to fifth gear, synchronization meant no double clutching, no grinding, no risk of mechanical error. To drive this tank, you didn't need a specialist, just someone who knew how to drive. That idea alone was almost offensive to the German mind. They documented the Continental R975 radial engine next. Simple, air-cooled, tolerant of dust and heat. It wasn't elegant, but it was unstoppable. It could run under conditions that would cripple Maybach engines in hours. One engineer wrote in his report, "This vehicle is built not for precision, but for survival." And for the first time, the German engineers began to sense a truth more dangerous than any weapon. The Americans had engineered simplicity, and that made it powerful. The testing began on a cold morning under a pale spring sky. Rows of officers and engineers stood beside the track, notebooks in hand, as the American tank, now labeled Zugkraft 259, rolled onto the proving ground at Kummersdorf. The same desert dust still clung to its tracks, as if the machine carried with it a trace of Tunisia. The first stage was simple: engine endurance. They ran the Sherman for hours at varying speeds, monitoring temperature, oil pressure, and fuel use. The gauges barely moved. At full throttle, the Continental R975 radial purred steadily. No overheating, no loss of power, no vibration that hinted at internal stress. The test leader frowned. He had expected a meltdown within 30 minutes. Next came the transmission trials. German tanks, even new ones, demanded delicate shifting, double clutching, exact throttle coordination, and the grace of a trained specialist. But the Sherman's driver, a young soldier with no armor background, moved through the gears effortlessly. No grinding, no jerks. From second to fifth, the gearbox synchronized like a car on a highway. "Try rougher handling," one of the examiners ordered. The driver smiled and slammed the throttle. The tank obeyed. Dust rose, but the transmission held perfectly. It was, as one engineer whispered, idiot-proof. Then came the obstacle course, ditches, slopes, and soft ground meant to cripple underpowered machines. The Sherman climbed the incline with slow, deliberate strength. Its tracks gripped cleanly, the suspension flexing without protest. Where German tanks would often stall or shed a track, this one kept moving as if unaware of the terrain beneath it. They disassembled components after each run. No fractures, no abnormal wear. Even the lubricants, standard American motor oil, retained their viscosity. The data accumulated like a quiet indictment. Fuel efficiency, better than expected. Operational range, extraordinary. Maintenance requirement, negligible. By the fifth day, the testing logs were full of contradictions, results that clashed with every assumption of German design philosophy. To the Kummersdorf engineers, the realization was unavoidable. The Sherman wasn't just surprisingly good. It was redefining what good meant. They gathered in the workshop late that evening, the smell of metal and grease thick in the air. Someone finally said what the others were thinking. "Our tanks fight the enemy. This one fights the battlefield." In that sentence lay the entire truth. The Sherman was not designed to dominate. It was designed to endure, to run again and again, no matter who drove it or where it fought. And as the men of Kummersdorf packed up their tools, the sound of the American engine still echoing faintly in the distance, a thought began to take shape among them. Quiet, almost reluctant. Perhaps this wasn't a miracle at all. Perhaps it was competence, industrial, disciplined, unstoppable. June 1943, Hillersleben, Artillery Range, Germany. The morning air was thick with the smell of oil and exhaust. Rows of officers, engineers, and industrial directors gathered along the test field. At the center, under a gray sky, stood 3 tanks. The brand new Panther AUSF, D, a heavy Ferdinand tank destroyer, and the captured American Sherman marked Zugkraft 259. The event was more than a test. It was a performance. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, had arrived to witness it himself, accompanied by senior officers from the Wehrmacht and representatives from Germany's leading manufacturers. The Panther was to demonstrate its power and vindicate the nation's engineers. The Sherman, by contrast, was there as a curiosity, a token, almost an insult, parked beside the Reich's proudest machines. Engines roared. The Panther went first, its 700-horsepower Maybach HL230 coughing to life with an almost arrogant snarl. Spectators nodded approvingly as it accelerated, treads biting into the soil. Then the Sherman started, its radial engine humming with a sound more like an aircraft than a tank, quieter, lighter, but steady. The test, a hill climb followed by a timed mobility circuit, simple on paper, but brutal on machinery. The Panther rolled forward, powerful but tense. Its gearbox growled, each gear shift a reminder of its complexity. Halfway up the slope, the driver hesitated. The transmission protested with a metallic shriek. The tank shuddered, regained momentum, and finally crested the hill, but with smoke rising faintly from its rear vents. Next came the Sherman. It advanced without drama. The driver shifted cleanly through the gears, the synchronized transmission humming like a civilian truck. It climbed, steady and calm, reaching the top almost too easily. No stalling, no smoke, just motion. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some engineers frowned, others scribbled furiously in notebooks. One officer muttered, "It lacks elegance." Another replied, "It doesn't seem to care." Then came the Ferdinand, a giant of 65 tons, armed with the formidable 80mm gun. It started the climb slowly, power surging through its electric transmission system. Halfway up, the engine groaned. The transmission stalled. And then, silence. For long seconds, the massive vehicle sat motionless on the slope, smoke curling from its rear vents. Speer's aides signaled for a tow vehicle, but even the recovery effort faltered. The demonstration, planned to inspire, had become a quiet humiliation. When the tests ended, no one applauded. The American tank had performed with the effortless consistency of a machine that didn't know it was being tested. The Panther, Germany's pride, had succeeded only through brute force, and the Ferdinand, its most advanced creation, had failed completely. Later that evening, in a private meeting, Speer said little, but the official statement released days later in Das Reich newspaper was unusually restrained. It praised the Sherman as a noteworthy product of the North American steel industry and admitted that its design displayed a surprising harmony between practicality and function. Behind closed doors, however, the tone was darker. Speer's own notes from that day contained just one line. We have built masterpieces that cannot move. The data from Hillersleben arrived at the ministry within days. Dozens of pages, measurements, temperatures, gear ratios, endurance logs. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. Just numbers. But numbers have a way of stripping away pride. The findings were impossible to argue with. The Sherman's operational endurance, over 2,000 kilometers before any major maintenance, was nearly 4 times that of the early Panther models. Engine lifespan exceeded 3,000 kilometers under combat conditions. Fuel efficiency was stable across a wide temperature range. Transmission failures, 0. Final drive failures, none recorded. German engineers had always believed in precision, tight tolerances, perfect fittings, minimal play. But those same qualities made their machines fragile. When dirt, heat, or stress entered the equation, perfection broke. The Sherman, by contrast, was built with imperfection in mind, forgiving tolerances, simpler materials, parts that fit well enough to keep going under punishment. One Kummersdorf engineer, reluctant to sign his own name, wrote in his notes, "Our tanks are made for engineers, theirs are made for soldiers." That single line spread quietly through the technical branches, copied into memos, and whispered in workshops. For years, Germany had believed that superior design could overcome material inferiority. Now, the realization was setting in. Design philosophy had beaten design precision. The internal report from Kummersdorf classified the Sherman as a model of practical engineering. It noted the modular transmission, the ease of driver control, and the automotive character of the entire vehicle. The authors concluded reluctantly, "The American solution emphasizes simplicity and reliability over technical performance. This principle ensures continuous availability of forces." Those last words, continuous availability, haunted the armaments office. It was a phrase that belonged not to glory, but to logistics. It implied that wars were not won by the strongest machines, but by the ones that kept running. When Albert Speer reviewed the report, he underlined a single passage in red pencil. "The American tank embodies a design philosophy alien to our thinking." That admission, more than any battle, marked the turning point. It was the quiet revolution, unspoken, undeniable. The realization that the Americans hadn't outgunned Germany. They had outlasted it. Every tank that ran one more day, every engine that didn't break, every gear that didn't seize, each was a weapon more powerful than a shell or cannon. Because in modern war, reliability itself was a weapon, and America had mastered it. While engineers in Kummersdorf debated the meaning of their findings, the truth was already visible thousands of kilometers away, on the assembly lines of Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. There, the miracle of steel was not a single machine, but a process. In America, factories ran day and night. Men and women worked in shifts under the glow of fluorescent light, building engines, transmissions, and armor plates with the same rhythm once reserved for automobiles. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, names once synonymous with civilian comfort, had become the backbone of armored warfare. Every part, from a bolt to a gearbox, was designed to fit into any Sherman, anywhere in the world. Interchangeability wasn't a luxury, it was doctrine. One tank could be repaired using parts from another built on the opposite side of the continent. A driver in Italy could strip a gear from a destroyed Sherman and fit it into his own vehicle without adjustment. That level of standardization was unimaginable in Germany. Each factory there built tanks, almost as if crafting instruments, hand-adjusted, finely tuned, unique. A transmission made in Kassel might not fit into a tank built in Munich without remachining. It was engineering brilliance without industrial discipline. And then came the bombing. By mid-1943, Allied raids targeted Germany's lifelines, Maybach, ZF, MAN, and the small subcontractors that supplied the Panther and Tiger programs. A single hit could halt production for weeks. When the Maybach engine plant at Friedrichshafen was bombed, Germany lost months of output. And then came the bombing. By mid-1943, Allied raids targeted Germany's lifelines, Maybach, ZF, MAN, and the small subcontractors that supplied the Panther and Tiger programs. A single hit could halt production for weeks. When the Maybach engine plant at Friedrichshafen was bombed, Germany lost months of output. Each misaligned bolt, each loosened gasket, was another quiet rebellion against a collapsing empire. The engineers at Kummersdorf knew none of this firsthand, but the data in their reports hinted at it. They could see it in the machining marks, the quality of welds, the uniformity of parts. Everything about the Sherman whispered of an industrial confidence Germany no longer possessed. One senior designer at Daimler-Benz summarized it in a letter never meant to be published. "We build masterpieces in small numbers. They build reliable mediocrity in tens of thousands. And mediocrity, when multiplied, becomes perfection." By the end of 1943, that statement had become prophecy. For every Tiger that rolled out of a German plant, America produced 20 Shermans. And while the Tiger impressed those who saw it, the Sherman arrived in Italy, in Normandy, in the Pacific. It didn't need admiration. It just needed to work. The war of steel was no longer fought on the battlefield. It was fought on the factory floor, and the factories that never slept were already deciding its outcome. By the spring of 1944, the lessons from Kummersdorf were no longer confined to reports. They were written across Europe, in broken tracks, burnt engines, and stranded Panthers rusting by the roadside. In theory, the German armored divisions still held the advantage. On paper, the Panther and Tiger outgunned and out-armored the American Sherman by every measurable standard. But in practice, another statistic mattered more: which tanks were actually moving. In Normandy, field reports told a painful truth. Of the 150 Panthers assigned to a single panzer regiment, fewer than 60 were operational at any given time. By contrast, an American armored battalion of 80 Shermans routinely reported 70 or more ready for combat every morning. The math was brutal, and it never lied. Panther crews learned to fear the sound of their own transmissions more than enemy fire. Third gear was a gamble. Turning while reversing could destroy the gearbox entirely. Final drives cracked under stress, leaving tanks immobile on roadsides before the first shot was fired. Some commanders issued orders: avoid unnecessary maneuvering, preserve the vehicle. In a war that demanded motion, German armor was learning immobility. The Sherman, meanwhile, was relentless. It advanced, withdrew, and advanced again. If it was hit, another replaced it within hours. If it broke down, it could be repaired in the field, with nothing more than a wrench set and 2 men. Parts fit, engines started, systems worked. German soldiers, desperate for reliable transport, began using captured Shermans themselves. In reports from the Eastern and Western fronts, officers described using the American tanks with minimal modification. No one needed to adapt a Sherman. It simply worked as intended. One Wehrmacht mechanic wrote to his superior in disbelief, "I have repaired both Panther and Tiger engines. Neither can match the simplicity of this American design. If I had 10 of these, I could keep a company moving indefinitely." The difference was philosophy made visible. The Germans had built tanks for control, machines that demanded mastery. The Americans had built tanks for continuity, machines that demanded only fuel and a driver. And that continuity began to crush the Reich. Wherever German columns tried to retreat, broken tanks littered the roads, their engines silent, their crews forced to destroy them to prevent capture. In contrast, the Sherman rolled past, often driven by soldiers who had never even seen a tank before the war. The battlefield itself became a museum of two worldviews. On one side, the remnants of precision, heavy, immobile, magnificent, and doomed. On the other, the hum of movement, imperfect, mass-produced, and unstoppable. By late 1944, German generals didn't need Kummersdorf's charts to understand the truth. It was written in every convoy that failed to arrive, every bridge blocked by a disabled Panther, every order cancelled because the tanks couldn't move. And as the Allies advanced eastward, the smell of burned oil and seized metal marked the passing of an empire that had worshipped perfection, until perfection failed to turn its own gears. January 1945, Brandenburg, Germany. Snow fell softly over the Kummersdorf Proving Ground. The same rails that had once carried War Daddy 2 north from Tunisia were now being torn apart to feed the defense of Berlin. The workshops stood half empty, the echo of tools replaced by the distant thunder of artillery. Inside one of the hangars, engineers packed crates of documents, drawings, blueprints, and testing logs stamped Geheim, classified. Among them were the full results of the Sherman trials. None of them dared destroy the papers. They knew they were more than reports. They were confessions. Outside, soldiers loaded captured vehicles onto trucks for evacuation. 2 Shermans, one still running, were among them. They would be pressed into emergency service, fighting not as test subjects, but as the last machines left that could still move. A young officer watching the evacuation turned to his superior and asked, "Sir, why take the American tank? We have Panthers." The older man smiled bitterly. The Panthers no longer wished to go to war. It was no longer irony, it was truth. German armor had become a monument to its own failure. Engines that refused to start, transmissions too fragile to shift, spare parts that no longer existed. Even the Tiger, once the embodiment of mechanical pride, now stood abandoned in the snow, its frozen tracks locked forever in place. In those last weeks, reality reached even the most faithful believers in German superiority. The engineers who had spent years chasing perfection watched as their perfect machines died around them, victims of the very complexity they had worshipped. One of them, a senior technician who had tested the Sherman 2 years earlier, wrote in his final report before fleeing west, "We built tanks as if they were jewels. The Americans built tools, and tools win wars." By the time the Soviets reached the gates of Berlin, the myth was gone. In workshops and factories, silence replaced precision. The great machine of German industry had consumed itself, its brilliance buried under the weight of its own arrogance. Kummersdorf was evacuated in haste. Many of its documents were lost to fire. Others were smuggled into the Western zones, where Allied intelligence would later study them in detail. Among the materials recovered after the war was a technical notebook labeled Zugkraft 259. Its final page carried only a few handwritten lines. The American tank was never extraordinary. It was merely reliable, and reliability, multiplied by thousands, becomes invincibility. The handwriting stopped there, no signature, no closure. The handwriting stopped there, no signature, no closure. February 1943, Tunisia. The sand has long since covered the tracks. But if you stand in that same desert where War Daddy 2 first stopped, you can still feel the silence, the stillness that began the unmaking of a myth. Back then, the Germans thought they had captured a tank. They hadn't. They had captured an idea. It was the idea that perfection is not strength, that the true power of a machine lies not in how sophisticated it is, but in how faithfully it endures. Every test in Kummersdorf, every broken Panther gear, every report that crossed Speer's desk, all told the same story. America had industrialized reliability. The miracle of the Sherman was never in its gun, its armor, or even its engine. It was in the mind that designed it. A mind shaped not by aristocrats of engineering, but by mechanics, drivers, and factory workers. People who built millions of engines before the war, and who understood something simple and eternal. If it doesn't run, it doesn't matter. That was the real revolution, the moment when industry stopped being about mastery and became about motion. The Sherman didn't need to be perfect. It needed to start every morning, move every mile, cross every bridge. And it did. When German engineers rebuilt their nation after the war, they didn't forget that lesson. At Krauss-Maffei and Porsche, the blueprints for a new generation of tanks took shape. The Leopard 1, designed not for spectacle, but for reliability. Its designers studied Kummersdorf's old notes, including the reports on the captured Shermans. The result would become one of the most successful tanks of the Cold War. Not because it was flawless, but because it worked. So, in the end, War Daddy 2 was not just an American tank tested by German hands. It was a teacher, a mechanical prophet, a silent reminder that endurance wins where brilliance breaks. The war of machines ended long ago, but its final verdict remains written, not in triumph, but in motion. The tank that moves is worth more than the one that amazes. The army that repairs is stronger than the one that redesigns. The civilization that builds to last, lasts. And so the dust of Tunisia hides no wreckage, only truth. The Sherman did not conquer through firepower or fear. It conquered through faith in function. Because in the end, it wasn't a machine. It was a miracle of steel, forged not to shine, but to endure.